Ukraine's 81st Airmobile Brigade cuts the primary Russian supply route into the Svatov sector on March 22, 2026. And within 8 hours, a Russian defensive architecture that has held since November begins collapsing, not because it is attacked from the front, but because it runs out of ammunition from the rear. Saturday, March 22, 2026. The Svatov sector's Russian defensive architecture had survived 15 Ukrainian attack attempts since November for a reason that was neither mysterious nor difficult to understand. It was exceptionally well supplied. The Russian First Guards Tank Army's logistics chain into the Svatov sector ran on a single primary route, a 47-kilometer road from the logistics hub at Starobilsk through Novoaidar to the forward distribution point at Kreminna Junction. The route was not hidden. It appeared in every NATO intelligence assessment of the sector's logistics architecture since October. It had been struck twice by HIMARS, once in November, destroying a fuel convoy, and once in February, destroying an ammunition transfer point at the Novoaidar junction. Both strikes had produced 1 to 3 days of supply disruption before the route was repaired and resupply resumed. The route's resilience had not been a failure of Ukrainian targeting. It had been a reflection of the route's redundancy, enough parallel track and road infrastructure within 5 kilometers to allow rerouting around any single point of damage within hours. Cutting a route with a HIMARS strike was temporary. Cutting a route by putting a force physically across it was different. The 81st Airmobile Brigade had been planning the route interdiction since March 9th. The fundamental question the operations cell had addressed before any tactical detail: how do you position a force across a supply route 47 kilometers behind the front line in terrain under continuous Russian observation with 3 QRF elements within response range without being detected before you are in position? The answer was not to move the force to the route overland. Move it through the air. At the specific moment when the Russian air defense network's coverage gaps aligned with the terrain-massed approach profile, the 81st Brigade's Mi-8 element had been practicing since January. The Mi-8s would fly at terrain-massed altitude along the Siversky Donets River Valley, whose tree-lined banks provided continuous radar masking on the approach bearing from Ukrainian-controlled territory. The insertion point was a forest block 3 kilometers from the route, the window when Russian air defense coverage gaps aligned with the river valley masking profile. 1:00 a.m. to 2:30 a.m. It opened every night. The brigade had been waiting for the NATO delivery that would equip the ground element for a sustained blocking operation under QRF pressure. The delivery arrived on March 19th, 12 Stinger MANPADS missiles with their gripstock launchers, additional ammunition loads for the brigade's Carl Gustaf anti-tank teams, and the item the operations cell had identified as the minimum requirement for a 47-kilometer deep insertion that would face a QRF response: 6 Javelin command launch units with preloaded missile packs sufficient for 18 engagements. The Javelin's fire-and-forget capability meant that the insertion team could engage Russian QRF armored vehicles from covered positions without the exposed sustained guidance requirement of wire-guided systems. A team of 12 soldiers with 6 Javelins could hold a position against a BTR-82A column long enough for the blocking operation's primary purpose, physical route interdiction, to produce its intended effect. The operations cell had assessed that physical interdiction of the supply route for 18 to 24 hours would reduce the Kreminna sector's forward position's ammunition reserves to below the 50% level that Russian defensive doctrine required for sustained defensive operations. Below 50%, the sector's defending units would begin rationing fire, reducing artillery and mortar support, restricting machine gun engagement distances, prioritizing ammunition for the closest range threats. A defense that is rationing fire is a different defense than a defense at full supply. At 1:17 a.m. on March 22nd, 8 Mi-8 helicopters departed a forward staging area 40 kilometers west of the Siversky Donets and began their terrain-massed approach along the river valley. 64 soldiers from the 81st Brigade's 3rd Air Assault Company, 12 Stingers, 6 Javelins, Carl Gustaf teams with 4 rounds each, demolition charges for the route itself. The flight took 31 minutes at nap of the earth in terrain that the NRO had confirmed clear of Russian ground observation posts in the River Valley sector. The helicopters landed in the forest block at 1:48 a.m. The insertion was undetected. The third company moved from the landing zone to the route's interdiction point, a road section crossing a stream bed where the terrain narrowed the passable width to a single vehicle lane. At 2:31 a.m., 43 minutes of movement through forest in darkness. Undetected. The demolition team placed charges on the stream crossing's culvert infrastructure at 2:38 a.m. The culvert was not a bridge. It was a reinforced concrete pipe section that carried the stream under the road surface. Destroying it would not create a dramatic bridge collapse. It would create a road surface collapse of approximately 12 meters above the destroyed culvert section. A 12-meter road surface collapse into a stream bed is impassable to heavy vehicles. Repairing it requires engineering assets and takes between 4 and 8 hours depending on available materials. The charges were set for a 3 a.m. detonation. The third company had 29 minutes to establish its blocking position before the detonation announced its presence to the Russian logistics network. The detonation at 3 a.m. was audible at the Russian logistics hub at Novoaidar, 11 kilometers north. The hub's duty officer transmitted a damage report at 3:04 a.m. and requested engineering assets to assess the culvert. A logistics convoy, 3 fuel trucks and 4 ammunition trucks, that had been en route from Novoaidar to the Kreminna junction and had been 3 kilometers north of the interdiction point when the detonation occurred, stopped at 3:01 a.m. The convoy commander assessed that the road ahead was blocked and attempted to contact Novoaidar for route guidance. The contact was made at 3:06 a.m. Novoaidar's duty officer told the convoy to hold position pending engineering assessment. The convoy held. Was the culvert demolition, announcing the 81st Brigade's presence at 3:09 a.m. and triggering the Russian QRF response, the correct sequencing, or should the blocking force have established itself fully before detonating, accepting the risk that the culvert repair might begin before the force was in position? Type A, if the 3:00 a.m. detonation was correct, the 12-meter road collapse was immediately effective, and the blocking force's position was established before QRF could respond. Type C, if the detonation should have waited until the blocking force was fully in place and had confirmed QRF approach routes. Drop your read in the comments. The Russian QRF response was initiated at 3:09 a.m. from 2 positions. The Novoaidar garrison, a motorized rifle company with 6 BTR-82As and 1 T-72B3 platoon, began movement toward the interdiction point at 3:12 a.m. The Kreminna Junction's reserve element, a 2nd BTR-82A company, began movement from the south at 3:14 a.m., converging on the block section from the opposite direction. Standard double envelopment response to a route interdiction, the 81st Brigade's operations cell had modeled exactly this response. 2 QRF elements converging from north and south on the interdiction point, and had positioned the 3rd Company's 6 Javelin teams accordingly. 3 teams covering the northern approach, 3 covering the southern approach, each team in a position with concealment from the direction of approach and line of sight to the 200-meter approach corridor before the block section. Subscribe and hit the bell. Every deep insertion and blocking operation gets this level of detail here. The northern QRF, the Novoaidar Company, reached the 200-meter approach corridor at 3:31 a.m., 19 minutes from the garrison to the block section. The Puma UAV that had been launched from the forward staging area at 1:01 a.m. and had been orbiting at 2 kilometers altitude over the route had the lead BTR-82A on its thermal feed at 3:29 a.m. and transmitted the approach bearing to the 3rd Company at 3:30 a.m. The 3 northern Javelin teams acquired their aim points at 3:31 a.m. First engagement at 3:32 a.m. The lead BTR-82A was struck by a Javelin from 800 meters. Top attack profile, the missile climbing to its attack altitude before diving onto the vehicle's roof armor. The BTR-82A's roof armor is 10 mm. The Javelin's tandem charge penetrates 600 mm of steel. The BTR-82A was destroyed in the first engagement. The column stopped. The T-72B3 platoon that had been in the column's 3rd position reversed to the column's rear. Moving backward on a single-lane road at night in a T-72B3 is slow, and attempted to establish a hold-down firing position. The 2nd Javelin team engaged the T-72B3 while it was in movement. During the 22 seconds it took to reverse to its firing position, the Javelin struck the T-72's top armor. The tank was destroyed at 3:34 a.m. The remaining BTR-82As dispersed from the road into the adjacent terrain. Not an organized defensive response, a survival reflex. The Northern QRF had lost its 2 highest value vehicles in 3 minutes and was no longer an organized force. The Southern QRF reached the block section's southern approach corridor at 3:41 a.m., 7 minutes after the Northern engagement. The Southern Element's commander had heard the Northern engagement. The Javelin's backblast was not silent and had slowed his approach. The Southern Element was moving at reduced speed, with the column's lead BTR-82A at 300 meters rather than the full approach speed that would have brought it into the 200-meter corridor at a rate that compressed the Javelin team's engagement window. The slower approach gave the Southern Javelin teams additional acquisition time and reduced the column's momentum in the engagement. 3 BTR-82As were engaged in the southern corridor between 3:41 a.m. and 3:47 a.m., 2 destroyed, 1 damaged and immobilized. The Southern Element withdrew at 3:49 a.m. The withdrawal was organized, a covering force withdrawal with the undamaged vehicles, providing suppressive fire while the damaged vehicle was recovered. The Southern QRF was not destroyed. It was stopped and withdrew. The Puma tracked its withdrawal to a position 1.4 kilometers south of the block section, where it established a static position and transmitted a situation report at 3:53 a.m. The 3rd Company held the interdiction point. Both QRF responses had been stopped. The culvert was destroyed. The road was blocked. It was 3:53 a.m. on March 22nd, and the Kreminna sector's primary supply route had been physically interdicted for 53 minutes. The logistics convoy that had stopped at 3:01 a.m., 3 kilometers north of the block section, 3 fuel trucks and 4 ammunition trucks, had been holding in position since Novoaidar's 3:06 a.m. instruction to wait for engineering assessment. At 3:53 a.m., with both QRF responses having failed, the convoy commander made a decision that had not been in any of the Russian response protocols he had been given. He ordered the convoy to reverse along the route and return to Novoaidar. Not because he had been instructed to, because the convoy was 7 trucks carrying fuel and ammunition, parked on a road 3 kilometers from a block section where a Ukrainian force had just stopped 2 QRF columns, and the Puma that the 81st Brigade's operations cell was watching was also being watched. The convoy commander did not know that, but his situational awareness told him that staying in place was not safer than moving. He ordered the return to Novoaidar at 3:54 a.m. The 7 trucks reversed and began moving north at 3:55 a.m. The Puma operator saw the convoy moving at 3:45 a.m. and transmitted the movement to the 81st Brigade's fire support coordinator. The fire's coordinator requested a HIMARS strike against the reversing convoy. The HIMARS battery was 62 kilometers west, within range. Authorization arrived at 4:01 a.m. The battery fired 2 M31 rockets at 4:02 a.m. against the convoy's lead position on the road. The rockets impacted at 4:03 a.m. 3 trucks destroyed in the direct impact area, 1 truck disabled by fragmentation. The convoy commander's BTR-82A escort vehicle, following the trucks, was struck by a secondary fragment and immobilized. The convoy commander was wounded, not killed, wounded. He was evacuated at 4:11 a.m. 3 of the 7 trucks that had been carrying fuel and ammunition to the Kreminna junction were burning on the road north of the interdiction point at 4:03 a.m. The other 4 trucks stopped. The road from Novoaidar to the Kreminna junction now had a block section at the interdiction point, a destroyed northern QRF at the 200-meter approach corridor, a static southern QRF 1.4 kilometers south of the block section, and 4 stopped trucks plus wreckage north of the block section. The route was not just interdicted, it was layered with obstacles across a 7-kilometer segment that no vehicle could transit without navigating around multiple impediments under observation from a Puma that the 81st Brigade's operator was keeping on station continuously. The Kreminna sector's forward positions began the morning of March 22nd with their standard pre-dawn ammunition report at 4:30 a.m. The report was a routine submission from each forward battalion to the Sector Command's logistics cell. The Sector Command's logistics cell received the reports and compiled them into a sector-level assessment at 4:45 a.m. The assessment showed standard ammunition levels across 4 of the 6 forward battalions. 2 battalions, both in the sector's southern element, which had been consuming ammunition at a higher rate since the 81st Brigade's previous operations had increased pressure on that flank, reported ammunition at 63% and 58% of standard load. Not critical, not yet. The standard load threshold for requesting emergency resupply was 50%. Both battalions were above it. The Sector Command's logistics cell transmitted a routine resupply request to the Novoaidar hub at 4:47 a.m. and received no response. The hub was managing the convoy wreckage, the QRF casualties, and the blocked culvert simultaneously at 4:47 a.m. The non-response was logged in the logistics cell system as a delayed acknowledgement. Unusual but not unprecedented, given the route disruption the sector had been managing since 3 a.m. By 9 a.m., 6 hours after the Culvert detonation, the Kreminna sector had received no resupply. The 2 southern battalions' ammunition levels had continued to decline as the morning harassment schedule. The standard pattern of mortar and artillery fire that Russian defensive doctrine used to slow Ukrainian reconnaissance and patrol activity consumed rounds at the pre-planned rate. At 9:00 a.m., the southern battalion that had been at 58% at 4:30 a.m. was at 44%, below the 50% threshold. The battalion commander submitted an emergency resupply request at 9:03 a.m. The Sector Command's logistics cell transmitted it to Novoaidar at 9:04 a.m. Novoaidar's response at 9:11 a.m. stated that the primary route was blocked, engineering was assessing the culvert, and all supply movement had been suspended pending route clearance and the Ukrainian forces' location assessment. Suspended. Not delayed, suspended. The Sector Command received the suspension notification at 9:12 a.m. and transmitted it to all forward battalions at 9:15 a.m. with a fire discipline directive: reduce all non-essential fire missions, prioritize ammunition for confirmed ground assault threats only, suspend routine harassment fire pending route restoration. The fire discipline directive was the first operational change the route interdiction had produced in the forward defensive positions. The Russian forward infantry who received the directive at 9:15 a.m. understood what it meant. The supply route was blocked, the resupply was not coming on a confirmed timeline, and the ammunition they had was what they had until the situation changed. The 95th Brigade's reconnaissance element that had been monitoring the Kreminna sector's fire patterns since 4:30 a.m. detected the change at 9:22 a.m. The standard pre-dawn harassment fire, routine mortar rounds, a few artillery missions, the pattern that marked a sector at full operational tempo, had dropped significantly since 9:15 a.m. Not stopped, reduced. The pattern reduction was the observable signal that the 95th Brigade's operations cell had been waiting for. The cell transmitted its assessment to the brigade command at 9:31 a.m. Fire pattern reduction consistent with ammunition rationing directive. Sector may be below 50% ammunition threshold in southern element. Assault window opening. The 95th Brigade's assault element crossed the start line at 10:14 a.m. The assault was not against the Culvert interdiction point. It was against the Kreminna sector's southern element, the 2 battalions that had been below and approaching the 50% threshold, using the same combined arms architecture that had been clearing sectors throughout the month. Archer Excalibur against the forward positions, JDAM-ER against the middle line positions, Leopard 2A6 and CV-90 ground element. The difference was the fire support available from the defending side. A Russian sector at full ammunition supply had a defensive fire capacity that could slow any assault and exact significant cost from the attacking force. A Russian sector whose artillery was rationing fire and whose forward battalions were prioritizing ammunition for confirmed ground threats had a defensive fire capacity that was the same in category. The guns existed, the mortars existed, but different in practice. The 9:15 a.m. fire discipline directive had told the defending commanders to hold their fire for confirmed ground threats. The assault that arrived at 10:14 a.m. was a confirmed ground threat. The defending commanders fired what they had against it. They had less than they normally would have had at this point in a morning assault sequence. Less was enough to wound 11 Ukrainian soldiers. It was not enough to stop the assault. The Kreminna sector's southern element's forward line was cleared by 11:47 a.m. 1 hour and 33 minutes from assault crossing to forward line cleared, the fastest assault completion the 95th Brigade had recorded on this axis. The middle line was reached at 12:31 p.m. By 1 p.m., with both the forward line and the middle line in Ukrainian hands and the rear line's command architecture isolated by a HIMARS strike at 11:52 a.m., the sector command transmitted a situation report to the 1st Guards Tank Army's operational command that described the southern element's position as untenable without immediate resupply and QRF reinforcement. The operational command's response arrived at 1:14 p.m. QRF reinforcement was being assembled. Route restoration was estimated at 4 to 6 additional hours. Immediate resupply was not possible until the route was restored. The sector command had 45 minutes to 60 minutes before the rear line's position would be reached by the 95th Brigade's exploitation element. The reinforcement was hours away. The answer to the situation report was, in operational terms, that the sector command was on its own. The rear line fell at 1:44 p.m. The route Interdiction at 3 a.m. had produced a supply suspension, a fire discipline directive, an assault against a rationing defense, the forward and middle lines fall, and the rear lines collapse, in that sequence across 10 hours and 44 minutes. Without the 81st Brigade's 3rd Company at the interdiction point firing a single weapon after the 2 QRF engagements ended at 3:49 a.m. The 3rd Company had held the blocked culvert through the morning, maintaining the interdiction while the Kreminna sector's defense ran its ammunition down from the inside. The culvert detonation, the Javelin engagements, the HIMARS strike on the retreating convoy. All of that had happened before 4:30 a.m. Everything after 4:30 a.m. was the sector's defense consuming itself without a resupply that was not coming. The 81st Brigade's 3rd Company was extracted by helicopter at 3:30 p.m., 12.5 hours after insertion. All 64 soldiers returned. No fatalities. 3 wounded in the QRF engagements. The Javelins had been used. 4 of 18 missiles fired, 4 vehicles destroyed. QRF responses stopped. The Stingers had not been used. No Russian aircraft had been employed against the blocking force. The Carl Gustaf teams had not engaged. The QRF columns had been stopped by the Javelins before any dismounted anti-armor engagement was required. The demolition charges had detonated as planned. The extraction was conducted in daylight, accepted as a higher risk profile than the insertion, because the sector's Russian air defense assets had been degraded by the morning's engagement, and because the 95th Brigade's exploitation element was now 3 kilometers south of the former Kreminna sector's rear line, creating a buffer that the Russian air defense systems could not cover from their remaining positions. What the March 22 operation demonstrated about supply line interdiction as a force multiplier was specific and transferable. A HIMARS strike against a supply route produced temporary disruption because the route itself was repairable. A physical blocking force across a supply route produced interdiction that persisted as long as the force held its position, and that the defender could only resolve by either clearing the blocking force or finding an alternative route. In the Kreminna sector's specific geography, no viable alternative route existed within the timeline that mattered. The 18 to 24 hours the operations cell had assessed as sufficient to push the forward battalions below 50% ammunition. The blocking force had held for 12.5 hours. The forward battalions had hit their threshold by 9 a.m. The assault had followed the threshold by 62 minutes. The defense that had held against 15 previous attacks since November had collapsed not because it was outfought, but because it ran out of the ammunition that had sustained it. And the ammunition had stopped at a concrete culvert that 64 soldiers with javelins and demolition charges had interdicted before dawn. 3 questions from March 22 that the next air assault planning cycle needs to address. First, the insertion was undetected because the River Valley masking profile aligned with the Russian air defense coverage gap between 1 a.m. and 2:30 a.m. How many other sectors in the current contact line have comparable masking profiles and coverage gaps that the Mi-8 element can exploit? And what is the intelligence requirement for validating each one before mission planning begins? Second, the Southern QRF's organized withdrawal left an intact force in observation range of the block section for the entire 12.5 hours of the interdiction. The third company held its position despite this observation. Would a follow-on HIMARS strike against the static Southern QRF have reduced operational risk to the blocking force, or created disproportionate ammunition expenditure against a force already neutralized? Third, the Kreminna sector's defense collapsed because its supply chain was physically cut for less than 18 hours. One primary route, no viable 24-hour rerouting alternative. Does that vulnerability represent a planning failure in Russian defensive logistics at the sector level, or a structural limitation of the Luhansk region's road network that Russian planning has been managing around rather than solving since November? Drop your full assessment in the comments. Like the video if this breakdown built the full picture of how 64 soldiers with a Culvert and 6 Javelins collapsed a defense that 15 previous attacks could not. Subscribe, hit the bell, and leave your read on what supply line interdiction as a systematic methodology means for the next phase of the campaign. The next breakdown is already in production,